Hello and welcome to Foreign Dispatches, the program that takes you around the world in 25 minutes. I'm Tenyola Shoboale. On the program this week, world leaders seek diplomatic solution to Ukraine conflict. Plus, a year on since coup in Myanmar, the United Nations accuses military leaders of crimes against humanity. Residents living along the border of Russia and Ukraine are watching intently the tension between Russia and Ukraine. But for two elderly couples, the destruction of homes in their small village near the front lines of the conflict in eastern Ukraine is raising fears of a worsening humanitarian crisis.
Elderly couple Katerina and Dmytro Shilkia are among the last residents of Nevelsk. The village is near the front lines of Ukraine's east, where years of fighting have left them without running water, electricity or neighbors. They rely on the Ukrainian military and aid workers to deliver basic goods.
It can't get any worse. Nothing can be worse than this. It's as bad as it can be. How can one survive like this? He's 86 and I'm 76-year-old, and we have nothing.
Nevelsk sits some 15 miles from Donetsk. That's the biggest city in the contested Ukrainian region, where Russia has backed separatist rebels fighting government troops since 2014. The conflict has killed 15,000 people to date. Russia annexed Crimea from Ukraine in 2014, and the West has threatened Moscow with grave sanctions if it invades again, something Russia has repeatedly denied it plans to do. Earlier this week, tensions between Russia and the United States over Moscow's troop build-up near Ukraine spilled into the United Nations Security Council when diplomats for both countries fiercely outlined their positions.
The threats of aggression on the border of Ukraine, yes, on its border, is provocative. Our recognition of the facts on the ground is not provocative. The threats of action, if Russia's security demands aren't met, is provocative. Our encouraging diplomacy is not provocative. The provocations from Russia, not from us or other members of this council. Russia has assembled a massive military force of more than 100,000 troops along Ukraine's border. These are combat forces and special forces prepared to conduct offensive actions into Ukraine. This is the largest, hear me clearly, mobilization of troops in Europe in decades.
Russia accuses the US and Western allies of making unfounded claims and seeking to use Ukraine as a tool to constrain Russia and not caring about Ukraine's actual interests.
The US keeps saying the military action of Russia against Ukraine that they're all assuring us is going to take place in just a few weeks' time, if not a few days' time. However, there is no proof confirming such a serious accusation whatsoever. Our Western colleagues are talking about the need for de-escalation. However, first and foremost, they themselves are whipping up tensions and rhetoric and are provoking escalation. The discussions about a threat of war is provocative in and of itself. You're almost calling for this. You want it to happen. You're waiting for it to happen, as if you want to make your words become a reality.
Although Russia insists it has no plans to invade, Western countries are threatening tougher sanctions.
It is vital that Russia steps back and chooses a path of diplomacy, and I believe that is still possible. We are keen to engage in dialogue. Of course we are, but we have the sanctions ready. We're providing military support, and we will also intensify our economic cooperation because we are a firm and enduring ally of Ukraine and a supporter of Ukraine's territorial sovereignty and integrity. It goes without saying that a further Russian invasion of Ukraine would be a political disaster, a humanitarian disaster. In my view, it would also be, for Russia, for the world, a military disaster as well.
Russia says NATO and the US have ignored its key security proposals and focus on secondary issues. It also accuses NATO of undermining the region's security and wants the alliance to cease military activity in Eastern Europe and block Ukraine from membership. Diplomatic efforts to avert an invasion of Ukraine have been ramped up, with officials from several sides of the crisis involved in high-level talks.
Meanwhile, as diplomatic talks continue to ease tensions, Ukrainian law enforcers have organized emergency drills after a series of forced bomb alerts this year forced the evacuation of schools in the capital Kyiv and other cities.
How much explosive can this fluffy toy owl hold? This is what this Ukrainian bomb disposal serviceman asked astonished children in an emergency drill class in Kyiv. Law enforcement officers organized the training after a series of Hawks bomb alerts forced evacuation of schools in the capital and other cities.
Everyone should understand the mechanics of possible reactions in the case of a situation. We are also teaching the difference between explosives and pyrotechnics.
The servicemen show the class video clips of explosions and scattering shrapnel, artillery and mortar shells, grenades and mines, as well as improvised explosive devices, some resembling a box of chocolate and a mobile phone case. Then, as siren went off at the school, everyone rose to evacuate. All of this is a stark reminder of the peculiar state Ukraine currently finds itself, neither at war nor at peace. Kyiv blames the Hawks alert on Russia already waging what they call a hybrid war against its former Soviet satellite. Ukraine's security service says they saw anxiety and panic among the public. It had recorded more than 300 bomb threats so far this year, compared to 1,100 for the whole of 2021. Kyiv says Russia is threatening a full-blown invasion by amassing more than 100,000 troops near the border. Moscow denies this. Russian officials have blamed Ukraine for similar series of bomb hoaxes that have forced schools, shopping centers, and kindergartens to evacuate tens of thousands of people. The West has threatened Russia with severe sanctions if it invades Ukraine. NATO has put its forces on standby. As everyone waits to see what happens next, students at this school prepare, lining up in the snow-covered schoolyard in Kyiv for the drills.
Away from Ukraine, this week marked the one-year anniversary of the Myanmar military overthrowing the elected government of Aung San Suu Kyi. In the years since taking power, the United Nations says the military has murdered and tortured civilians while waging a campaign of terror.
It's been 1 year since Myanmar's military seized power. The coup abruptly halted the Asian nation's long-awaited transition to democracy. Peaceful protests were met with violent crackdowns, journalists were arrested, and recently, airstrikes. The United Nations says at least 1,500 people are known to have been killed in a year-long protest against the coup, with thousands more possibly killed in the armed conflict. The junta disputes the reported number of casualties.
We have documented 1,500 people who have been killed But this is only in the context of protests. So killings of protesters, killings in the context of protests, which means where security forces have entered people's homes, conducted raids and killed them. And these also include people who were killed while in custody, while in military custody. Some 200 of them were killed due to torture in military custody. This 1,500 does not include people who were killed due to the armed conflict. On that, we have not been able to collect or to verify any figures. We do understand that they are in the thousands. At least 11,787 people have been arbitrarily detained, and this is for voicing their opposition to the military, whether in peaceful protests or through online activities even. Some of them have been released, and 8,792 remain in custody as of today.
With thousands of people also displaced, the UN Secretary-General has urged Myanmar's ruling military to allow humanitarian aid access and address the desperate needs of its people. The junta has vowed not to bow to international pressure and has been highly critical of the UN, accusing its envoys of bias and interference. A day before the one-year anniversary of the coup, military leader Min Aung Hlaing extended a state of emergency for another 6 months on the basis of facilitating promised elections. The military took power after claiming voter fraud in a 2020 general election won by Aung San Suu Kyi's party. Suu Kyi and other senior figures from the National League for Democracy were detained in morning raids. Since then, she has been sentenced to 6 years in jail in legal proceedings that rights groups have criticized as a farce and is on trial in nearly a dozen cases that carry combined maximum sentences of more than 100 years in prison. She denies all the charges. On the streets of Yangon, there are still occasional flash mob anti-coup protests. Activists say more than 8,000 people are detained in prisons, but the military has not disclosed the exact number of people in detention.
And over in Sudan, in the aftermath of the military takeover there, Sudan's resistance committees are taking center stage against military rule. In the coup's aftermath, the committees have organized demonstrations that have drawn hundreds of thousands in cities across Sudan, as well as smaller protests, barricades and strikes, defiant communications blackouts, and a security crackdown that medics say has killed at least 79 people.
Ahmed Ismat has a tear gas canister wound across his cheek, covered by a large plaster. A coup in Sudan on October the 25th has propelled these young people and other members of the resistance committees onto the front line of the struggle against military rule. As their standoff with security forces continues, the committees are drafting a charter to try to harness their grassroots activism into a political movement with broad appeal to better achieve their goals.
The Resistance Committee Charter will represent the bare minimum of our demands and the basic structure of what we want the state to implement, but it will be a very detailed document.
Sudan Coup derailed a 2-year transition towards elections that was rocky but had brought hopes of democracy after 3 decades of autocratic rule under Omar al-Bashir.
As for the committees making the political declaration of the charter, this is because there is no incubator. And as you know, the streets rejects the parties because of what happened. And of course, the military is impossible to rely on. The responsibility is fully on our shoulders. We have to steer the country to safe shores.
Without commenting directly on the committees, the military has said that civilian groups in general should support national consensus and reconciliation. The charter, expected in the next days, will outline core demands and a vision for the future. It's also intended to help mobilize a broader coalition of support. For now, the committees face more immediate challenges in a campaign fraught with physical risk. The military and the police have said that peaceful protests are allowed, that security forces have sometimes had to defend themselves, and that protest casualties are being investigated.
When Foreign Dispatches returns in just a moment, countries in Asia celebrate the Lunar New Year under the shadow of the COVID-19 pandemic for a third year running. You're still watching Foreign Dispatches on Channels Television. We switch focus to the COVID-19 pandemic now. A global leader in vaccine rollouts during early waves of the coronavirus, Israel's government has adopted living with COVID as its mantra since a few months before Omicron arrived. But as Israel learns to live with COVID, hospitals are struggling to cope.
Israel, a global leader in vaccination, is struggling to look after COVID-19 patients amid a surge in Omicron cases. The government adopted living with COVID as its mantra a few months before the highly infectious variant arrived. And although Omicron is causing fewer severe infections and deaths, the skyrocketing caseload has meant that hospitals are filling up fast.
The main difference is that we see for the first time many staff, many team of the nurses and doctors that are sick, and they have to go home, and we have generally an average 10%, 15% less doctors and nurses, whereas we need 20-30% more because of the flood of patients. So this is very different because we had doctors that were sick before, but not in that amount that we see with the Omicron.
The staff shortage has also forced hospitals to cut back on other procedures and divert resources to COVID wards.
The staff is exhausted. And this is another reason that we need to be aware of. It's not like we're starting the first outbreak where everybody was full of energy. Today people are already tired. They have to wear these masks, which are very difficult to wear for hours. We're closing some surgical departments. We're reducing the number of surgical activities. We have reduced the number of patients we have in each internal medicine department in order to divert manpower, nurses and physicians to treat COVID patients.
Several scientists urged the government to intervene to reduce infection rates in mid-January. But the government, backed by other experts, stuck to the softer touch approach of managing the virus that it adopted last summer.
When we look at the Omicron wave, we can see that the government carefully handled the elements of the quarantine and the tests in order to minimize the burden on the citizen, to minimize the heavy situation of a closed market and closed education system. On the contrary, it worked towards opening the education system as far as possible, enabling the market as far as possible, and keeping the number of hospitalized patients as low as possible. So to sum up, I think that the government acted as expected in such a difficult situation.
The government has rolled back curbs while urging the public to self-test and stay at home if they are sick, mirroring moves in a number of Western nations, including Britain and France. In January, it cut isolation times and cut quarantine for school children exposed to a carrier. Noting the fact that 65% of Israel's 9.4 million population has been vaccinated with the recent booster jab or second dose. Daily cases passed 80,000 in late January before easing back over the past few days.
For a third straight year, COVID-19 has dampened the travel plans of millions of Chinese for the Lunar New Year. Pre-pandemic, the celebration would have seen as many as 3 billion trips made across China and was the world's largest annual migration of people. But resurgent virus outbreaks forced many to cancel their plans. However, traditional dazzling displays were lit across the country to welcome the Year of the Tiger. Take a look.
A spectacular view of glittering city lights spreading across China's landscape as millions of Chinese families gathered to celebrate the Lunar New Year. The stunning footage was captured from the International Space Station by Chinese female astronaut Wang Yanping. Back on Earth, a close-up of the light displays in the country is also impressive. The skylines of 4 Chinese cities were lit up with colorful lights and images as part of the nationwide celebration of the Year of the Tiger and the Beijing 2022 Winter Olympic Games. A sea of lanterns also turned Xingong City in southwest China, Sichuan province, which is famous for lantern making, into a fairy tale world to welcome the new year. The Lunar New Year, which starts on February the 1st, is ordinarily the world's biggest annual migration when hundreds of millions of China's migrant workers return to hometowns, but travel warnings over virus risk deterred many this year. Even as increasing vaccination rates raise hopes that the Year of the Tiger might bring life back closer to normal, people across Asia also marked the Lunar New Year with muted celebrations. In Hong Kong, which saw a surge in cases in January, people wore surgical masks as they shopped for red and tiger-themed holiday items. The city has closed schools because of outbreaks and required restaurants to close at 6 p.m, forcing many to have their traditional New Year's Eve family dinners at home. In some Asian countries, though, celebrations were not as subdued as they were last year. Despite ongoing pandemic restrictions, most people have now received 2 vaccine shots in many regional countries. Malaysians celebrated with a roaring return of an underwater lion dance performance, as well as a visit to the temples.
A lot happier as compared to during the lockdown period where you're alone and you do things alone. You feel very lonely, right? Now that you get to be in touch with your family, yeah, it's a lot better.
For this year, I feel more even though we still keep a social distance, but however, I feel the freedom to go out and visit and do the things that I like to do.
This is the 3rd Lunar New Year in a row celebrated in the shadow of the pandemic. It was 2 days before the holiday in 2020 that China locked down Wuhan, a city of 11 million people, following the detection of the coronavirus there.
Important documents like passports are usually designed in a no-nonsense and straightforward manner. But the Belgian government has decided to jazz up this travel document. On January the 27th, Belgium launched the new passport that has comic characters as its design theme. Take a look.
The Belgian government unveiled its new passport on January 27th, decorated with characters from some of the country's most famous comic characters, including Tintin and the Smurfs. Far from being embarrassed by having pictures usually for children printed on her country's official documents, Belgian Foreign Minister Sophie Wilms says the fame of Belgian comics is the country's pride.
You know, Belgium has a very great reputation. We are a very small country, and if we do not think about ourselves too seriously, we are serious people, we work hard. This is one of the safest passports in the world. It's one of the most powerful passports in the world in the terms of where it does bring you. But it is true that art, like comics, could be considered to be a little bit less serious, but I don't agree with that perspective. And to be honest, to be able to show that around the world, we are well known around the world for that reason, I think it's a very good thing.
According to the government, the decision to incorporate comic book characters was taken not only to pay them tribute, but because its unique design makes it harder to duplicate.
You know, your passport brings you everywhere in the world, and certainly the Belgian passport. And it is true that we are very proud of the comics and the Belgian comic that our country has managed to develop. And I don't know if it's soft power, but it's very powerful, I have to say. And therefore we chose it also because we are not only very proud of what we are doing in Belgium, but it gives also us the opportunity to use the drawing as an element of security for our passports.
In the streets of Brussels, the new passport is well received.
I think it's nice to receive a bit of Belgian culture. Maybe those abroad will not necessarily understand it, but it's nice to have a touch of humour in our time. And it won't be appreciated by everybody, but I love it.
I think it's a great idea. I think a lot of people internationally, especially me living in Canada as well, a lot of people associate the cartoons with Belgian culture. So I think it's really cool to be able to identify with that through the passport, which is something you use so often. So I think I really like it. It's creative, it's different, it's unique.
The new passport will be launched on February the 7th and will be accompanied by a temporary exhibition on the history of the Belgian passport at Brussels Comics Art Museum until March the 6th.
Well, this is where we say goodbye till next time, but remember, our top stories are never far away. You can catch them on channelstv.com. Thank you so much for watching the program. I'm Tenyola Shobowale. Bye for now.